Tonight, we're going to look at some of the objections to biblical prophecy. These have been somewhat interspersed throughout the material, and yet we're going to put them all together in one session here tonight. Some people would say, for a prophecy to be fulfilled, we need to know that the fulfilling part occurred. But how do we know that Jesus did the things that are fulfilled in prophecies like Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, Daniel 9, Micah 5:2? How do we know that those things were fulfilled in Jesus historically? This objection, not very good. If you believe that the argument for the resurrection is solid, which I do, this argument is far more easy to make. In other words, to make the historical evidential case for the bare minimum facts of the fulfillment of Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, and Daniel 9, way easier than making the argument for the resurrection. Let me give you a very simplified form just to show what I mean. For one, the core events of Jesus' life and death, we're not even getting into the resurrection or his miracles. These are confirmed by ancient non-Christian historians and authors, many of them. And they had no motive to want to help fulfill Bible prophecy or want to support the Christian cause because they were hostile to Christianity. Let me give you some examples. Let's start with Tacitus. He's writing about AD 110, 115. He's considered the most reputable, venerable historian in Rome at the time. He writes in Book 15, chapter 44. Consequently, he's in context referring to Nero's fire in Rome, in one of the quarters of Rome. To get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt of the fire and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, the Latin rendering of Christ, from whom the name had its origin, the Christians came from whom? Christus, the Christ, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, AD 14 to 37, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, AD 26 to 36. So that puts us within the window of Jesus' death, within a decade. It speaks of Christus, the Latin rendering of Christ. It tells us where Christians got their origin. People wonder, why didn't Tacitus refer to Jesus? Why does he call him Christus? Well, he wasn't trying to explain the origination of the Jesusins. He was trying to explain the origin of the Christians. And to explain the origin of the Christians, you refer to the Christ. So, what is the extreme penalty to a Roman historian? The cross. Jesus died by the cross in a certain time period, in a certain place. And as we've said before, he refers to an immense multitude in Rome by AD 64. There you go. I'll give you one other example because I don't want to labor this point. Lucian of Samosata, he's a Greek satirist writing in the second half of the 2nd century. He is an ancient SNL writer. He's a satirist. He's making fun of different people and groups and persons. And here he's making fun of the Christians because they got duped by this guy named Peregrinus. Peregrinus was a fake Christian, but the Christians are so bleeding-hearted for this man, and he's thrown in prison, and they're bringing him food. But Lucian says Peregrinus was playing him the entire time. It's in that context, referring to these stupid, misguided, gullible Christians, that he writes this. The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day. They worship a man, this distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites, and he was crucified. They worship a crucified man. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time. These stupid people, they think they live forever. That explains their contempt for death. They don't mind dying, no fear of death. And, God, these do-gooders, it's always volunteering and devoting themselves to other people. It just makes me sick, that's common among them. They're always doing good and loving the community and loving others and giving their goods away. And he goes on in this section of the death of Peregrinus. He says, it was impressed on them that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage, and they live after his laws. The sage, the teacher, the crucified teacher. They worship a man, and yet they deny the gods of Greece. So they don't believe in these polytheistic deities that are basically just anthropomorphic gods. Zeus, urinating, having sex with women, stuff like that. Dionysus, getting drunk. It's basically big humans. They deny all that, the polytheism of the Greeks. But they worship a man, a crucified sage, and they believe that they're going to live forever. So, does this demonstrate that Jesus... Let me put it this way. If you were hauled into court and you had four of your close friends that knew you, and they were supporting your case. Let's say they're guy friends of yours, four of them. Let's call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, okay, just to pick names out of a hat. They support your case, that you died by crucifixion in a certain time period, in a certain way. They support your case. But then you bring in multiple other people that are hostile and hate your guts. Let's call them Tacitus, Lucian, Suetonius, Josephus, the Babylonian Talmud. We bring them in. They take the stand, and they say, I hate this guy's guts. I don't like him. I don't like the people he hangs around with. I don't like anything about him. He's misguided. The people around him are misguided. They're stupid. It's superstition, but everything they said was true. Think about how much that would boost your testimony in a court of law. That's what we're seeing here. Even if we threw out the New Testament, we could make the case that Jesus died in the early 30s AD, that he was crucified, and all that entails. That's all we need. This is why even modern atheistic historians, no lovers of Christianity or Christians or the Bible, I overstated that. They could love Christians. I don't know. They don't love Christianity, and they don't love the Bible. Atheistic historians will affirm the key facts that we're referring to here. So, Bart Ehrman, he says in his book, Did Jesus Exist?, which he took so much flack from the atheistic community. They just about crucified him for writing that book. But he said, did Jesus exist? The answer, in short, if I want to give you the spark notes of the book, yes. Yes, he did. And the idea that Jesus was a myth itself is a myth. Ehrman at one point spoke before the secular society, skeptic society, and he said, you atheists are doing yourselves a disservice saying things so foolish. Like if you want to say that in your little tribal groups, you can get away with saying Jesus was a myth. But when you go out into the rest of the world, you look foolish to the rest of the world. And about 3 atheists clapped in the skeptic society. Ehrman says, to dismiss the Gospels from the historical record is neither fair nor scholarly. Now, if you know Ehrman, or if you've read Ehrman, you know he doesn't believe everything in the Gospels. He's a critic. He's an atheist. Actually, he's moved to a kind of agnostic. He's moving back and forth, honestly, but it doesn't matter. My point is, he doesn't accept everything in the Gospels, but his point is just to get rid of them and incinerate them. That's not scholarly responsibility, or that's not responsible as a scholar. He says one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified, and Jesus died almost certainly from the 30s of the Common Era. There's Daniel 9. Now, he places it at AD 30. I would place it at AD 33. There's an argument that goes 50-50 both ways, but I gave you my reasons for thinking AD 33. And I gave you the other reasons for why people would go with AD 30. So, there's that. Gerhard Ludemann, atheistic German New Testament critic, he says, quote, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. This isn't something that we should be arguing about. When you have an atheistic critic call Jesus' crucifixion indisputable, quote unquote, that's how you know you've gotten historical bedrock. John Crossan, as one person said, my favorite heretic. John Dominic Crossan, sweet Irish guy, very friendly, but his views are the most extreme of anyone I've listed so far. He is so far out, he believes that only 17% of the red letter words of Jesus in the Gospels go back to the historical Jesus. That's how critical he is. He wrote that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. This right here, we are on solid ground. And that's just a very we haven't even considered the epistles of Paul, the four biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and anything else. We've just looked at the non-Christian views, and just on that alone, we can show that these prophecies were fulfilled external from the New Testament. What if these prophecies were self-fulfilled by the disciples and or Jesus? Again, this is a huge admission to make. If someone says the disciples or Jesus self-fulfilled Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, or Daniel 9, they've just admitted that Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, and Daniel 9 are very clear and compelling and speak of Jesus. Now, if they want to go through those interpretive gymnastics and say, I don't think Isaiah 53 is really about Jesus, I think it's about the nation of Israel. I don't think Psalm 22 is really about Jesus, it's about Israel or King Hezekiah or Esther or David himself. They can go that route if they want. Or they can go the route of the disciples self-fulfilled it and made it look like Jesus fulfilled it by telling the story a certain way to make it look that way. But they can't have it both ways. Let me give you an example. Somebody says, who do you think goes to heaven? And I say, well, only people that trust in Christ go to heaven. All of us have fallen short. We need someone to pay for our sins. And they interrupt me at that point and they say, well, I don't believe it's that Christian stuff. I believe good people go to heaven. Okay? That's one view. Good people go to heaven. We continue to talk, and I start talking about the Crusades. No, I can't say that. I start talking about different moral issues, let's say in our culture. And they say, well, I don't believe that good and evil exist. Okay? So moral relativism over here. Good and evil don't exist. But good people go to heaven. So I don't believe that there is a good, but good people go to heaven. Either the disciples self-fulfilled the prophecies because they depict Jesus so clearly, or these predictions don't refer to Jesus at all in the first place. They're too nebulous and vague. But you can't have both. See my point? So this is a huge admission. Okay, I'm laboring the point. Let me keep going. Jesus and his closest disciples had no motive for self-fulfilling these predictions. What was the motive for Jesus climbing up on that cross? As we said before, crucifixion was horrific. It comes from the Latin excruciatus, ex, the Latin prefix meaning out of or from, cruciatus meaning the cross. Excruciate literally means from the cross. Josephus describes crucifixion victims being whipped so much that their bones and their intestines were showing through their lacerated skin. Their skin was ripped apart like ribbons. Seneca says that as they were lifting up on the cross, that this was basically, they were suffocating, asphyxiating over hours and even days before they would die. Josephus calls crucifixion the most wretched of deaths. Paulus calls it the most severe punishment. Cicero calls it cruel and disgusting. Why? What's the scenario? Paint that for me. The disciples say, we want to start a religion. Okay, cool. And we want you to be the head of the religion. We're going to call it Christianity after you, because Christ is your last name and Jesus is your first name. So we're going to call it Christianity. I'm joking. After you. And Jesus is like, I always wanted to be a religious founder. This sounds great. What do I have to do? Well, this is what we're going to do is we're going to get you killed. Peaceful? No, not peaceful. Throw me off a cliff and you stone me to death, throw stones on me, knock me out quickly maybe? Oh, no, that'd be too easy. You're not thinking what I think you're thinking. Yeah, crucifixion. Because we want to self-fulfill these prophecies from the Old Testament. So we're going to have you crucified. And so then what do I get out of it? Well, you get to be the founder of a religion. So then like women and girls and money and stuff, I get that out. No, you'll be dead. You'll be crucified. No one survives crucifixion. Josephus describes 3 people who came off of crosses. Out of all the historical texts on earth, we have one from Josephus that says 3 people survived crucifixion because Josephus said, I recognize those 3 guys. I know them. Please bring them down. He made an appeal to the authorities. They brought him down, gave him the best medical treatment available. 2 of them died. 1 of them barely survived. Okay, so that's the picture before us for Jesus. Why would you do that? Why would you agree to that? well, maybe Jesus accidentally got crucified. That doesn't make much sense. Why would you kill a Jewish Palestinian preacher? Because he was pretending to be a wise sage? No, Pontius Pilate doesn't kill wise sages. He kills people that are threats to Rome. That's the people who he kills. So why would he be killed? Because he was claiming to be Messiah, claiming to be a king. Well, Jesus went through with that. Well, maybe he had the alternative that he wanted to get money. He wanted to get rich off of starting a religion. No, he says in the Gospels, in two places, Luke chapter 9, verse 58, he says specifically, foxes have dens and birds have nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Matthew 17, they're going into the city and they say, Peter, your rabbi, he doesn't pay the 2 drachma tax, temple tax. Jesus says, well, we'll pay it. Yeah, sure, but I don't have it. I got no money. Go into the mouth of the fish. Get the money out of there. Jesus wasn't wealthy. He didn't make money off of this. What about power? He refused to be treated as a king. John 6:15, he actually pushed that away when people tried to force him, compel him is the word in Greek, to be a king. He skirted across the Sea of Galilee, feeding of the 5,000. When Pilate asked him, are you a king? He said, you say, su lege, you said it. So are you going to try and rise up? No, my followers aren't going to bring swords and spears and stuff. My kingdom is not of this world. And Pilate at that point says, okay, all right, he's a philosopher king. All right, he's not any danger to anybody. And he lets him go. Not power. What about sex? John Dominic Crossan, that scholar I just cited, Irish guy, he has an article called Why Jesus Didn't Get Married, Mary. Now, of course, that's a little bit of a play on words because Mary Magdalene was thought to be Jesus' wife, if you've seen or read the Da Vinci Code. John Crossan, who is no Bible believer, he said there's one thing that all of us agree on in New Testament studies. It's that Jesus didn't get married and didn't have a girl on the side. It just didn't happen. Jesus was single. So, no money, no power, no sex. And the disciples, Paul, same thing. He was treated poorly. He was tortured. He gave up his power. He was a Sanhedrist. He gave that up. He lost his status, his credentials. In Philippians chapter 3, an undisputed letter of Paul. Even the critics say Philippians was written by Paul of Tarsus. Philippians 3, he says, I had all the status and the money and the education. I call that all skubalon. Go ahead and look that up in your Greek dictionary. You'll see it's a cuss word. It's dung. It's excrement. Paul never married, at least that we know of. But he says, don't I have the right to have a wife, a believing wife? He didn't get married. He wasn't married. So what's the motive here, and why did Jesus' closest disciples all go to their deaths in defense of Jesus? So Paul, beheaded in Rome, AD 67. This comes from multiple sources. The first source is a Christian source, 1 Clement chapter 5. This dates anywhere from 65 AD to 120, probably 95. Probably 95. And 1 Clement 5 says Paul was killed in Rome. If you want more detail on that, there's multiple church fathers that speak to this. Peter was crucified in Rome in AD 67. I don't believe the story of Origen in 250 that he was crucified upside down. Have you ever heard that? I want to be crucified like my Lord. Or I don't want to die the way my Lord died. And they played a practical joke and they crucified him upside down. That comes from 250 years later from Origen. I don't believe that's true. I believe the earlier records that say he was crucified. Peter died at the hands of the Romans, Nero, crucifixion. This comes from early sources, AD 95. James, the half-brother of Jesus. Now think about that. You've probably heard me say this before. Some of you have brothers. How much would it take for you to go to your death believing that your brother who died, the most shameful death of the day, was God incarnate, the Messiah of humanity? You grew up with him. You knew him. James wasn't a believer in Jesus during his earthly life. It isn't until Jesus' death that James becomes a follower of Christ. This isn't mentioned only in Christian sources, though it is. It's mentioned in Clement of Alexandria. That's about 200 AD. It's mentioned in Josephus. a non-Christian Jewish Roman historian, book 20, he says, James, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. Not that he was the Christ, but the so-called Christ. And the Jewish Sanhedrin, Josephus says, had James executed. It was unlawful. Clement of Alexandria says that he was pushed off the temple. He fell, they stoned him, and then he wouldn't die. They beat him to death with clubs. So he was killed, beaten to death like an animal. Paul, a hater of Christianity. Peter, Jesus' arguably closest follower. And James, his half-brother. All go to their deaths. Why? Why do you do that? What that shows is their sincerity. It doesn't show their veracity. That's different. Many people go to their deaths for all sorts of reasons. But you don't go to your death for a lie. Right? Unless you're getting something out of it. Unless it's getting you some kind of a benefit for somebody you love. You don't go to your death for a lie. Something you know to be a lie. It shows that you are psychologically sincere. So the idea that they self-fulfilled it is out of bounds. Self-fulfilling these particular predictions isn't strategic. This isn't strategic. Hey, let's start a religion. Great idea. Great idea. We got Jesus. He's charismatic. He's authoritative. He's tough. We got our guy. We got some disciples. They're not that good. But Jesus, man, he's great. And we're going to start a religion. How are we going to do it? Okay, let's have them die. Who do you follow? Zeus? Zeus. Isn't he like the real big one? He's cut. He's got pecs like Brad Pitt. Isn't that Zeus? Like Zeus? Yeah, I worship him. What about you? Like Apollos, man, he's a great speaker. Apollos, Hera, Dionysus. Who do you worship? Jesus. Who? Jesus. Jesus. Sounds like a Jewish name. It is. He's Jewish, yeah. Well, who's he? Does he have like a cool thing about him? Like God of war, God of speech, God of the sea or something? No, he was the crucified one. Like the guy who got, whipped and bloodied, and he's the crucified one. That's your message? That's what you're, that's not strategic. If you're trying to start a religion, you start it with a crucified king. That's an absurd concept. And we have this in the literature. Celsus says, I just can't believe that. I can't believe in a crucified king. Trypho, he says, I am having a hard time on this point. There's no way you're going to convince me in a crucified Messiah. Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22 weren't interpreted as messianic prior to Jesus of Nazareth. Let me put that in a different way. Let's start a religion. Great idea. Let's use predictive prophecy to get it started. Oh, I like where you're going with this, brother. All right, we got our Hebrew Bible. Yeah, which passages? Let's pick the passages that nobody thinks refer to the Messiah. Like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. Nobody interprets them that way. And today, right now, we have no source that comes before the time of Christ that interprets Isaiah 53 or Psalm 22 messianically. I don't know if they did. We just don't have a source. And we don't have sources for Psalm 22 or Isaiah 53 from Judaism for hundreds, if not 1,000 years after the time of Christ. They could have done better. I mean, why not pick the prophecies about not the suffering servant? Who would want to do that anyways? It's not strategic. Let's get you to be the conquering king, like all of the other messianic pretenders in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Why not be the Psalm 2, the Son, who, kiss the Son or he will be wrathful, but blessed are those who have refuge in him. Why not be that? Why not be Isaiah 9? The government rests on his shoulders. Why not be that? No, we're going to be the one who's crucified and killed. That isn't strategic. Finally, self-fulfilling some of these prophecies was just downright impossible. They could not have done this. Like the worldwide spread of the gospel. They are all dead and have been dead for 19 centuries. And yet, within 300 years of Jesus' death, we have nominal Christians throughout the entire Roman Empire. But before Constantine, in AD 313, allegedly coming to faith in Jesus, we can debate that, but Constantine making Christianity the official religion of Rome, for the first 300 years, Christianity grew to 20 million people. They couldn't have self-fulfilled that. Daniel 9 is, in my opinion, the greatest piece of predictive prophecy I've ever read, biblical or otherwise. Guess how many times the New Testament authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, Paul, Peter, Jude, James, how many times the New Testament authors cite Daniel 9, 24 to 26? Zero. They cite Psalm 22 a couple dozen times, Isaiah 53 several dozen times. They're all over Isaiah 53. They're all over Psalm 22. How many times did they say Daniel 9, 24 to 26? Zero. Never. Now, skeptics say, well, that just shows that they didn't believe this was fulfilled in Jesus. My response? No, they couldn't demonstrate that this was fulfilled in Jesus. They didn't have the historical method. They didn't have encyclopedias. They didn't have access to Herodotus, Thucydides. This didn't have evidential weight in their time period, any more than Paul would be arguing about cosmology at Mars Hill. They didn't know about the Big Bang. He didn't know that at the time. Now, do they know of Daniel 9? Yes, they do. Jesus cites Daniel 9:27 in Matthew 24:15. They knew this passage, but they never cite it as referring to Jesus. So let me back up. What that means is they self-fulfilled the greatest predictive prophecy known to man, and they never talked about it. If I pulled that off and I got it down to the year, I'd be singing it from the rooftops. That would be all I'd write about. And they don't say a word about it. In fact, nobody was able to calculate this at the time. The earliest reference is Irenaeus in AD 180. He completely botches this prophecy. Not even close. Nobody follows Irenaeus' view. Julius Africanus, AD 200, gets close. He gets close. But still, he can't. They didn't know the decree's date. Africanus says it starts with Nehemiah 2. I got that. And I know it's years. I got that. I don't know when the original date started. I don't have a calendar to even put this on. He couldn't get it. Others knew. Suetonius, remember? Suetonius, Josephus, Tacitus. They said there's a prophecy that the Judeans are going to rule the world, but we know it's referring to the emperor. They knew it was soon. And they knew it was in the first century. And they knew it was coming. And there's a messianic fervor, but they couldn't get it. So much so that in the 3rd century, Rabbi Rob, talking about Daniel 9, what about the anointed, the Mashiach, Najid, Messiah, the Prince? What about him? Wasn't he supposed to come? What delays his coming? They knew by the 3rd century, the 200s, the time has passed. We don't have calendars and Wikipedia and Herodotus, and we got none of that, but we know it's been past 483 years. We know it's been that long, at least. And this rabbi said, all the predestined dates have passed, and the matter depends only on repentance and good deeds. Translation, the Messiah was predicted. He didn't come. We were too sinful. He didn't come. So now we just need to pray for Messiah and work harder and be better, and then eventually Messiah will come. No, he did come. He came right on time. But you missed him. He came right to the year, AD 33. And at this time, they couldn't have known that. But today, after the historical method, after the Enlightenment, we can look back and get the date, get the timeline, and see all this quite clearly. What if these predictions were written after their fulfillment? What if it is the case that it's what critics call an ex eventu prophecy? Ex meaning from, eventu meaning eventu, event, from the event. So I've got a prediction that Barack Obama will win in 2012. I got that prediction. Well, it's ex eventu. He already won in 2012. Well, what if these prophecies were actually written after the fact? What if that is actually what's going on here? Impossible. Critics, if you're a critic, you can't go this route. The Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was translated between 250 and 132 BC. So they would have started with the first 5 books, the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then they would have done the prophets, and then they would have done the writings. But by 132 BC, Emmanuel Tov, who's a Jewish textual critic and a scholar, not a Christian, he says, by 132 BC, we've got Ecclesiasticus, or Ben Sirach. That's a non-biblical, Jews and Christians don't believe that's in the Bible. This book, though, says in 132 BC, which is very, very easily dated, that the Hebrew scriptures are dressed up in Greek. So by 132 BC, we've got the Hebrew Bible dressed up in Greek, translated into Greek. And this would mean the entire Hebrew Bible, because we have the Septuagintal manuscripts and everything today in various codices, and you'll have to take my canon class to talk about that, but we have those. We have the Septuagint in various manuscripts, and it's already done by 132. We got the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered, that have every book in the Hebrew Bible, all 39 books, except for Esther. Now you say, why wasn't Esther included? I don't know. They don't have Esther in there. But I do know they have the entire corpus of the Old Testament besides Esther. I'm not saying they have complete books of Genesis, Exodus. I'm saying they have a portion of every book. And they've got commentaries on these books. So these books definitely preceded Christianity, for sure. Even skeptics agree on this point. If you're a skeptic, please don't embarrass yourself. Don't say that these things were written after the time of Christ. Jim Lippard from infidels.org, he's an atheist, in fide meaning faith, no faith. He says prophetic statements do not post-date the events in question. These prophetic statements do predate these events in question. They came before Jesus, in other words. All right, let's look at the big three, my three favorite, if you can't tell. Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, Daniel 9. If we're going to get specific, and you're like, that's the whole Old Testament. Yeah, well, what about Psalm 22 specifically? In the Psalms, maybe you've read through your Bible, and you open up the Psalms to Psalm 1, good place to start. That's kind of the doorway into the Psalms. And in Psalm 1, it says, Book 1, Book 1, Book 1. And then you get to Psalm 42, and it says, Book 2. What? Book 2. And yeah, and then you get to Psalm 73, Book 3. And Book 4, Book 5. There's 5 books in the Psalms. So the Psalms are one book. But then there's 5 books in the Psalms, and then each Psalm is its own book. So we have 150 books and 5 books and one book, the Psalms. Book 1 and Book 2 were published first, according to scholarship. So of all the 150 Psalms, books 1 and 2 were published first. That's why they're Book 1 and Book 2. And these were pre-exilic, before the exile. You say, what does that mean? Before 587 BC. In which book do we find Psalm 22? Book 1. Psalm 22 is pre-exilic. Does that make sense? Bashan is mentioned in verse 12. The bulls of Bashan surround me. Craig Davis, in his excellent book, Dating the Old Testament, he says, Bashan is in the north. It's up here. And when, you remember, David gives birth to, doesn't give birth. David has a son named Solomon. Solomon has a son named Rehoboam, and he has a foreman, a leader, an architect named Jeroboam. And Jeroboam takes over the northern part of the kingdom, Israel. And Rehoboam, Solomon's son, takes over the southern part of the kingdom, Judah. When does that happen? 931 BC. There's a civil war, there's a split, and there's a chasm that exists throughout Israel's history. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. That happens in 931. This Psalm 22, is written by David, and he mentions the bulls of Bashan. Are the bulls of Bashan in the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom? The northern. Now, if Israel was one kingdom at this point, it would make sense for David to reference the bulls of Bashan in the north, because it's all one big kingdom. It doesn't matter. But if the nations were split, it would make no sense to reference the bulls of Bashan, because that would be after 931 BC. This would mean, according to Davis, this is evidence that this is actually written pre-931 BC, before the division. So that would mean that the author lived sometime during the days of Solomon or the days of David, like the superscription states. Why mention Bashan unless this is a united monarchy? The grammar is ancient. In verse 6, there's a certain verbal form. I don't want to bore you, but there's a certain verbal form that's very ancient. I'm not going to say it takes you back to 1000 BC to the time of David. I am going to say it's very ancient. But if you want to get really skeptical, we have 2 copies of Psalm 22, not in their entirety, but in part, that date to 50 BC. 50 BC, before the time of Christ. So we have copies, we have physical copies that are 100 years before Jesus or so. Psalm 22 certainly is before the time of Christ. What about Isaiah 53? Critics used to date this to the time of the Maccabean era, 167. Fine. Let's date it to 167. What are you saying? Are you saying you don't believe Isaiah wrote it in the 8th century BC under... Well, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about predictive prophecy. And if you want to date it to 167, fine. That means Isaiah predicted Jesus 200 years in advance rather than 750 years in advance. Okay? Well, these critics were greatly embarrassed when the complete manuscript of Isaiah, 24 foot long, every verse from Isaiah 1:1 to 66:24, was found in Cave 1 of Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In its entirety, there's the book of Isaiah, dating to the very time when they think it was written. We already have a manuscript in 150 BC. This means that it must have been earlier, just like the Septuagint. If you're already translating the Bible by 132, that means it's got to be earlier. It has to be. You don't do a Greek translation unless you have a standard text. What about Daniel 9? In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have 8 copies of the book of Daniel, but they're not complete, like most of the copies in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're fragments. They're fragmentary. They've fallen apart. Give them a break. It's been 2,000 years. I know it's arid and dry in those caves, but it's been 2,000 years. And we have 8 manuscripts of Daniel, but they're not complete. And none of these contain Daniel 9:24 to 27. Wouldn't that be nice? But we don't have that. But all 8 scrolls, quote, reveal no major disagreements against the Masoretic text. What we do have in those texts lines up with what you have in your Bible. There's no disagreement. Moreover, we have the Testament of Levi. I can elaborate on this if you want, but there was a sect in the Essene community that wrote this manual, basically, called the Testament of Levi. In it, it mentions Daniel 9:24 to 27. This dates to 146 BC. And we have a fragment called the Melchizedek fragment that mentions Daniel 9:24. Who is that? The messenger who is anointed of the Spirit, spoken about by Daniel. Who is the Mashiach spoken of by Daniel? That's Daniel 9:25. That dates to 50 BC. So no matter how you cut it, and again, here, critics will say Daniel was written in 167 BC. I don't believe that for a second. I believe it was written in the 6th century. But let's say it was. We're talking about predictive prophecy. That means he predicted it 200 years in advance. To put it differently, let me see if I can suss this out a little bit further. Which is quantitatively more difficult to predict? Something 200 years in advance? Something 500 years in advance? Or something 1,000 years in advance? Well, James, that's a stupid question, you idiot. Quantity? 200 years is a smaller quantity than 500, you idiot. Didn't you take math? The quantity's smaller. And 1,000, that's 5 times the quantity of 200. So obviously, predicting something 1,000 years in advance is a higher quantity than 200 years in advance. That's not my point. Not which is quantitatively more difficult to predict, which is qualitatively more difficult to predict. You say, I don't follow. Okay? Who would have had an easier time predicting the life and death of Mark Zuckerberg? He hasn't died yet, by the way. Don't check your phones. Don't be worried. All right, Meta's still on its way. It's going to take over the world. It's going to be fine. All right? Mark Zuckerberg, the billionaire, Facebook entrepreneur, who would have had an easier time predicting that man's life and death? Stephen Hawking, Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin, or Isaac Newton? Yikes. I wasn't slamming that to make a point. You say, well, those are all smart guys. I mean, but predicting Mark Zuckerberg, such a specific person, and the internet, I mean, they didn't even, well, I guess Hawking knew about the internet. Hawking. I'd go with Hawking, yeah. Well, he lived at the same time as Zucker. Hawking, okay. Yeah, Hawking lived at the same time. What about Einstein? Yeah, Einstein probably better than Darwin, right? Darwin died in 1882. So I'm going to go with Einstein, yeah. Predicting between Einstein and Hawking, but wait a minute, we said the death of Mark Zuckerberg. Stephen Hawking is dead. So which would have had an easier... Still, I would go with Hawking or Einstein. That's not the point. We're not talking about those two. We're talking about these two. Making a prediction from 1884 or from 1684. Which is easier? Neither. 1884, 1684, or 1484. Let's go back to Galileo Galilei. Would he have had an easier time? None of them would have had an easy time because qualitatively it's, I don't want to say equally improbable, but pretty close. Once you get into hundreds of years in advance, qualitatively, I'm saying there is no substantive difference.